I don't want to waste your time, so there won't be an intro. This video once again starts with an old friend of mine, the SSG Clubhouse basement drone. That one is by far my favorite strategy in the entire game, and I make some kind of reference to the strat basically every other video. But what if I told you that this particular strat is just one specific manifestation of a much larger philosophy? And in this video, we are going to explore that philosophy. Naturally, we are going to start by taking another look at the SSG Clubhouse basement drone. I've already made a separate video explaining the setup in detail, link in the top right corner, but I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. The key characteristic of that strat is that SSG is basically roaming on the entire map. They have 4 outside walls on the top floor reinforced, they have a bunch of rotation holes prepared, and they are using the mute Mozzie combo to make droning the top floor a real pain for the attackers. On the ground floor, they are playing a Vigil in bar, who is supported by a castle barricade towards billiard and another one towards main door. But the genius of this strat lies in how they decide to play the roam game. Instead of setting up crossfires in order to fight the attackers on the top floor, SSG is always prioritizing survival. And this is where those castle barricades come into play. Because their real job is to make sure that Mozzie and Mute always have a safe way of dropping down, first into bar and then back to side. And while other teams take gunfights, SSG consistently manages to have all 5 players back on site for the final moments of a round. And this idea of continuously falling back, prioritizing one's life, and being very mindful of what kind of engagements to take are the key characteristics of the philosophy that I was talking about earlier. Because the thing is, their basement drone is not the only strat that they are playing according to those ideas. Look at the way they've been playing Bank Basement, for example. I know Bank isn't in the pool anymore, but you'll see, this is too good of an example to not include. First, look at the operator lineup. Other than Valkyrie, it's exactly the same as the one on Clubhouse. Now look at the castle barricades and the reinforcements. A lot of them are placed far away from the actual site, and then to top it off, we have hatches open that allow you to drop all the way from first floor into the basement, with Mute and Mozzie playing on the top floor. In essence, that is exactly the same strat as the one they're using on Clubhouse, just applied to a different map. And I personally think that this is absolutely fascinating. But you can not only observe this philosophy in strats that were specifically designed around that philosophy, like this one and the one on Clubhouse were. You can also see it in the more default strats, the ones that are pretty common among every Pro League team. Here we have an example on Clubhouse Gym, where SSG always has Rampy playing inside cash, only for him to always retreat and prioritize his life whenever teams are actually playing a cash take. Or this one on Villa with their kitchen defense. Just like every other team, they start out by playing in Astro, Trophy and Statue, but then they regularly drop into Courtyard instead of fighting it out. Naturally, both of those examples are a bit smaller in terms of scale, but I hope that I could show you that this really is a philosophy they are subscribing to, and one that really influences the way they play on a lot of the sides. Alright, so with that being established, let's talk about whether this idea of prioritizing your life and falling back instead of fighting is actually a good one. Because a lot of the other Pro League teams are evidently not playing their defenses like that. If we take a step back and kind of consider it in a more general way, the idea of roamers falling back when they're being droned or pressured is neither a new nor a controversial one. Obviously, roamers are supposed to fall back in a situation like that. But that's not at all what's happening here. SSG is not just randomly roaming around the map, shooting drones and then falling back. They are actively investing resources, such as reinforcements, castle barricades, and ADS, to hold some part of the map far away from the objective, only to then not use that utility by dropping back early without fighting. Look at the way SSG is playing their reading defenses on Cafe. They've got reinforcements, mute jammers, ADS, and shields placed all around Cocktail and Tarps, but they ultimately decide to drop down instead of fighting. But here we can see just why falling back is so powerful. Look at the situation that LG is in. 1 minute left, barely any drones left, and almost no nades, EMPs, or Ash charges left. Now, on the surface, it might seem like SSG just abandoned a strong position, and in that case they could have used their utility elsewhere. But the only reason they were even able to waste that much of LG's time, utility and drones is because they had a setup that allowed them to play a proper cocktail hold. And to top it off, here LG didn't even realize that SSG was long gone. Seems weird, but happens a lot more than you'd think. But if we ignore that last aspect for a second, there is still no reason why dropping down would be better than staying and fighting, right? LG is out of utility either way, regardless of what SSG is doing. The key idea here is that, from the attacker's perspective, playing a 5v5 without utility is a lot more difficult than playing a 3v3 without utility. And here I'm just assuming that if SSG were to stay and fight, it would on average end in a 3v3. The game is just a lot more complex with 10 people alive, and that obviously works in the favor of the defenders, who have the luxury of just being able to wait. Now, there might not always be 5 good spots for every defender to play in, but in a situation where the attackers are low on drones, you are much more likely to get away with playing in a bad spot. Also, as a quick side note, a lot of teams just don't have a good grasp on the theory behind attacking a side in a 5v5. They're doing fine in 3v3s because that's how it usually ends up, but in a 5v5, they often don't know how to position all 5 players properly. Alright, so by now, I've created a narrative of this philosophy being a core aspect of SSG's playstyle, and you might think that you'd be able to see it in action in every single round. But sadly, reality doesn't care about my narrative one bit. It's true that SSG is falling back more often than the average Pro League team, but they're certainly not falling back every single round, and that is best illustrated by looking at a few more reading defenses. As you can see, both Rampy and Canadian are taking fights here, even though they technically are able to fall back. They just decide against it. And the same is true for the other sides too. Remember how SSG sometimes jumps down trophy on a kitchen defense? Well, there are just as many rounds where they end up getting into gunfights. So it's not like SSG is just mindlessly falling back every single round regardless of what is actually happening. But that opens up an interesting question. Is the decision to fall back just made more or less randomly in the spur of the moment, or is there maybe some kind of pattern behind it? To answer that question, we're going to examine the way that SSG was playing their server hold on Bank. I'm going to show 3 different rounds and try to see if you can spot a pattern here. SSG is always playing a shield at the bottom of server stairs, and then they always have Ella and Jaeger playing inside server. TSM is burning ADS and they're nading the shield, but Ella and Jaeger continue playing in server. Now Capitao fires close, and Thermite is opening the hatch, and both Ella and Jaeger fall back. Okay, next round, same strat. Capitao is on bottom server stairs again, Buck tries to nade Ella, and right after, Jaeger falls back, but Ella stays. She only runs away after Buck has thrown the second nade, and Thermite is opening the server hatch. Alright, on to the last round. Capitao is pressuring bottom server stairs again, but the shield is still intact and there haven't been any nades so far. Now Thermite opens server hatch and both Ella and Jaeger run away. What you just saw was basically the exact same thing happening 3 times in a row. So what's the pattern here? What was prompting Ella and Jaeger to fall back? Sure, you've already noticed, but SSG always fell back as soon as TSM was opening server hatch. That was the only consistency across all 3 rounds. And that gives a lot of credit to the idea that SSG is not just randomly falling back. Instead, it seems like they have specific prompts that trigger this behavior. In this case, it's server hatch being opened. And those prompts can be either predetermined or subconscious in nature. Sadly, I wasn't able to find such a prompt for their reading defense on Cafe, but we can make an educated guess. If we take another look at the round, you can see how LG managed to open Freezer Wall just a second before SSG decided to drop. You know, probably not a coincidence. And this is where the double edge part comes in. This philosophy is obviously an intentional part of their playstyle. In a way, it can be considered a sword in the armory of SSG. And I hope I was able to convince you earlier that this sword actually has a sharp edge. But if it turns out that you, as an attacker, can identify and manipulate the prompts that SSG is using, then this sword suddenly gets double-edged. And the thing is that I know that it's possible to find and abuse those prompts, because back when I was coaching Rogue in Season 10, I made use of that myself. Kind of a bummer that all the interesting stuff happens on Bank, but can't do much about that. What you're looking at right now is more or less the same strat that I showcased at the beginning of the video, where SSG is playing in a way that is very similar to their Clubhouse basement drone. When I was preparing for that match, I obviously watched their other recent games on Bank too, and that's where I saw this round against Reciprocity, and I managed to spot the prompt that SSG was using. Zofia opens Teller's Wall, and this directly leads to all of the roamers dropping back to site. And with the prompt discovered, that's how we made use of it. We sent Eclipse into lobby to open Teller's Wall, and then we had Vert in Janitor opening up the floor right above the hatch, because we knew that they were going to drop. And just like that, we got 2 kills and map control within the first minute of the round. I love it when a plan comes together. Now, that was a pretty extreme example, I'd say, but it also works on a smaller scale. Let's look at one of the Villa rounds again. Here, Jaeger drops down, but he runs into the waiting arms of Julio. Now, him being in living might not have been pre-planned, but it certainly could have been. And that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, their philosophy of prioritizing survival and wasting time instead of fighting is naturally a very powerful one, especially against teams that have weak strategy and coordination, because those teams need fights in order to simplify the game. But on the other hand, whenever you're doing something consistently, you're bound to create a pattern that can and will be abused. But to be fair, SSG is doing a pretty good job of making it difficult to understand these prompts and patterns. So at least for the immediate future, there's no concern of them just being full-on countered or anything. I, for my part, certainly hope that SSG continues to be successful. I just really like the way they're playing the game. There's always something to learn, and they really proved just how far you can get by focusing on strategy and tactics instead of just on raw mechanics. Maybe that explains why half the videos I made in the past 3 months are more or less about SSG. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you learned something new, and thanks for watching.